They said it loud enough for the whole table to hear my mom laughing. "You'll never own a house like your sister." And Chloe smirking. "She'll be broke forever." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled. And they mistook that smile for surrender. Weeks later, their car rolled up my driveway. Their calls coming one after another, as if they suddenly had questions about the life they swore I'd never build. I stood inside the doorway of the house they said would never be mine, and typed 4 words that ended everything. "Get off my property." Drop a comment, and let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. To understand why I locked that door, you have to understand the architecture of my family. My father, Richard, is a property developer who sees land as nothing more than a balance sheet. My mother, Patricia, is an interior designer who believes value is determined by the price of the drapes. And then there is my sister, Chloe. Chloe is a luxury real estate agent who sells gray boxes to millionaires soulless. Glass cages that look expensive but feel empty. They deal in curb appeal. I deal in bones. I am a restoration architect. I don't build new things, I save old ones. I look at a crumbling structure and see the history, the structural integrity, the soul waiting to be uncovered. But to my family, my career is a joke. To them, if it's old, you bulldoze it. If it's broken, it's trash. Because I spent my days covered in drywall dust, instead of closing commissions in high heels. They decided long ago that I was the failure. The one who just didn't have the drive to succeed in the real world. For years, I let them believe it. I sat at their dinners, listening to Chloe brag about 6-figure commissions, while my mother made passive-aggressive comments about my dusty boots. They thought I was silent because I was ashamed. They thought I was quiet because I was weak. They were wrong. My silence wasn't surrender. It was a survival strategy. There is a concept I learned a long time ago. Something that feels like an invisible chain wrapped around your throat. When you grow up in a house where your achievements are treated as threats, and your happiness is viewed as competition, you learn very quickly that visibility is dangerous. If you shine too bright, you get cut down. If you want something too much, they take it just to prove they can. I learned this the hard way 3 years ago. I had found a small, charming cottage I wanted to restore for myself. I made the mistake of showing the listing to my father, looking for a shred of approval. 2 days later, Chloe bought it. She didn't even want it. She flipped it 4 months later for a quick profit and laughed about how she saved me from a money pit. That was the day the invisible chain snapped. I realized that sharing my life with them was handing them ammunition. So, I went underground. I stopped talking about my projects. I stopped sharing my wins. I let them think I was struggling. I let them believe I was barely making rent on my tiny studio apartment. I let them enjoy their superiority because it made them careless. While they were busy judging my thrift store furniture and my generic groceries, I was aggressive in the shadows. I lived on 30% of my income. I took on extra restoration consulting gigs. I ate rice and beans while they dined on steak. And I put every single extra dollar into a high-yield savings account that they didn't know existed. They looked at me and saw a woman who was stuck. I looked at myself and saw a coiled spring, waiting for the exact right moment to release. I endured the insults at Thanksgiving, not because I had to, but because I knew something they didn't. I knew what I was about to buy. And I knew that when I finally signed my name on that deed, it wouldn't just be a purchase. It would be a declaration of war. It started with a listing that had been sitting on the market for 212 days. In the world of high-stakes real estate, a property that sits that long is considered dead. It has a stigma. Agents whisper that there is something wrong with the foundation, or the title, or the soul of the place. My sister, Chloe, had actually sent it to the family group chat a month earlier with a laughing emoji. She called it the concrete coffin. My father, Richard, had replied immediately. He said, "That's a teardown. The land is worth $600,000. But the demolition costs alone would kill the margin. Garbage." They looked at the photos and saw a rotting, overgrown mess of moss and rusted steel clinging to a cliff edge in the Pacific Northwest. They saw a liability. I looked at the same photos and saw a masterpiece. I recognized the lines immediately. The cantilevered deck. The specific pitch of the roofline. The way the glass curtain walls engaged with the horizon. It wasn't just a house, it was a lost work from the mid-century era. Likely built by one of the greats who favored privacy over fame. It was structure as art. But because the siding was gray and the driveway was cracked, my family, the so-called experts, couldn't see past the surface. They only knew how to sell shine. They didn't understand substance. I drove out to see it at dawn on a Tuesday. The fog was thick, wrapping around the house like a shroud. I climbed over a fallen branch to get to the front door. The air smelled of salt and pine needles. The windows were caked in decades of grime. But when I wiped a small circle clean with my sleeve and looked inside, my breath caught in my throat. The bones were steel. The layout was revolutionary. It wasn't a teardown. It was a sleeping giant. Standing there on that cracked concrete, I felt a surge of adrenaline that was colder and sharper than anything I had ever felt before. This was it. This was the weapon I had been saving for. But I knew I had to move with surgical precision. If Chloe knew I was interested, she would buy it just to burn it down. If my father knew I saw value in it, he would outbid me to prove he was the smarter developer. I couldn't let them know I was even in the state, let alone looking at property. I drove straight to a lawyer's office in the next county. I didn't use my name on the paperwork. I created a limited liability company. I named it Fortress Holdings. It was a shield. A blank face that gave away nothing. Then, I made the offer. The asking price was $900,000. I went in at $850,000. Cash. With a 10-day close. To the sellers, I was just a faceless entity willing to take a problem off their hands. To my bank account, it was a hemorrhage. I liquidated everything. The high-yield savings account I had been building for 4 years. The stocks I had quietly accumulated. I even took out a private loan against my future earnings. I scraped together every single cent of liquidity I had to my name. When the wire transfer went through, I had less than $2,000 left in my personal account. I was eating ramen noodles in a rented studio apartment, sleeping on a mattress on the floor. But I owned $850,000 worth of steel and glass on the edge of the world. I remember sitting in the title office, the pen hovering over the signature line for Fortress Holdings. My hand didn't shake. I thought about my father's voice calling it garbage. I thought about Chloe laughing at the listing. I signed my name. The ink looked like a promise. They thought they were the kings of real estate because they moved volume. I was about to show them what it meant to create a legacy. I walked out of that office with the deed in my bag. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just the architect of someone else's vision. I was the owner. The next 6 months were a blur of drywall dust, welding sparks, and the smell of ozone. I moved into the property, setting up a cot in the only room that had a watertight ceiling. I woke up with the sun and went to sleep when my muscles seized up. My family thinks restoration is what they see on television, a fast-forwarded montage where you pick some tile, paint a wall, and suddenly, it's a showpiece. The reality is brutal. It is peeling back layers of rot to find the cancer in the framing. It is grinding rust off steel beams until your hands vibrate for hours after you stop. It is a fight. And while I was fighting to bring a masterpiece back from the dead, my family was busy writing my obituary. The family group chat became a daily newsfeed of my apparent failure. Because I was pouring every waking hour and every spare dollar into the house, I stopped showing up to Sunday brunches. I stopped buying new clothes. I looked tired. I looked broke. To them, this was proof that I was finally collapsing under the weight of my own mediocrity. One afternoon, my phone buzzed against the concrete floor while I was laying the subfloor in the main atrium. It was a photo from Chloe. She was standing in front of a sprawling, soulless mansion in the suburbs, one of those modern farmhouses that are just white boxes with black window frames. She was holding a sold sign. The caption read, "Another record-breaking commission. $120,000 in my pocket today. Hard work pays off." My mother replied instantly with a string of heart emojis and a message, "So proud of you finally. Someone in this family understands the value of curb appeal." Then, a direct text to me from my mother, "Cleo. We haven't seen you in weeks. Are you okay? You know, there's no shame in admitting if you can't make rent. Your father knows a property management company hiring receptionists. It might be good for you to have some stability." I stared at the screen, my hands covered in sealant, my hair full of sawdust. A receptionist. That was the ceiling of their ambition for me. They couldn't conceive that the instability they sensed wasn't a free fall, it was the chaos of creation. I didn't type back a defense. I didn't send them a photo of the mid-century teak cabinetry I had just uncovered, or the way the light hit the ocean from the cantilevered deck. I typed back, "I'm fine. Just busy." Busy, doing what Chloe chimed in, pouting. I let them have it. I let them have the narrative that I was the jealous, struggling sister, hiding away in her shame. It was safer that way. If they thought I was failing, they wouldn't come looking. They wouldn't sniff around. They fed on my perceived failure like vultures. It made them feel secure in their own success. But the house was changing. Week by week. The rot disappeared. The fogged glass was replaced with crystal-clear panes that erased the barrier between the living room and the Pacific Ocean. I stripped the painted-over beams down to their original, rich mahogany. The structure wasn't just standing anymore. It was breathing. There is a specific kind of silence that happens in a house when it is finally watertight and level. It stops creaking. It feels solid. One evening, standing in the center of the great room as the sun set, turning the entire space into a box of golden light, I realized that I wasn't just restoring a building. I was rebuilding my own spine. My mother saw me at the hardware store a week later. I was buying industrial-grade polyurethane. I was wearing work overalls and my boots were caked in mud. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and distaste, scanning my outfit like it was a costume of poverty. "Oh, Cleo," she sighed, touching my arm with 2 fingers. "You look exhausted. Is this really the life you want, scrounging around?" I looked her in the eye. I thought about the $4.2 million asset sitting on the cliff edge, hidden behind the trees, registered under a company she didn't know I owned. I thought about the legacy I was saving while she worried about appearances. "I'm happy, Mom," I said. She shook her head, a sad, patronizing smile on her lips. "I know you have to say that, sweetie, but we're worried." She walked away, confident in her superiority. She didn't know she had just spoken to the owner of the most valuable property on the coast. She saw dirt. I saw equity. And the gap between what she saw and what was real was where I lived. The appraisal happened on a Tuesday morning. Under a sky so clear, it looked like it had been scrubbed. I invited Mr. Sterling, the most reputable appraiser in the state. He pulled up in a sedan that looked too modest for the kind of numbers he usually crunched. When he stepped out, he adjusted his glasses and looked at the house, the way the cantilevered roof sliced through the air, the way the floor-to-ceiling glass reflected the Pacific like a mirror. He stopped walking. He didn't look at his clipboard. He just stood there, staring. "I thought this place was a rumor," he said quietly. "The lost Erickson. People said it fell into the ocean in the 90s. "It didn't fall," I said, opening the massive pivot door. "It was just waiting." He walked through the house for 2 hours. He ran his hand along the restored teak paneling. He checked the seismic retrofitting I had installed in the bedrock. He looked at the smart glass technology that turned opaque with a touch. He didn't speak much, just hummed and took notes. When he finally sat down at the kitchen island, a slab of quartzite I had sourced from a quarry 3 states away, he put his pen down. "You bought this for $850,000, he asked. "Yes. Cleo," he said, looking me dead in the eye. "I am going to appraise this property at $4.2 million. And honestly, in a bidding war, you could get 4.2 million. I sat very still. My hands were folded on the counter. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just felt a heavy anchor, drop into the pit of my stomach. It was the weight of validation. My father, the great developer, had looked at this land and seen $600,000 worth of dirt. My sister, the luxury expert, had laughed at it. I had seen what they couldn't. I had created over $3 million of equity with my bare hands and my vision. But money wasn't enough. I knew my family. I knew their specific brand of greed. If they found out about the value, they wouldn't just be jealous, they would be dangerous. They would try to force a sale. They would try to claim I tricked them, or that I was unfit to manage such an asset. Or worse, if they ever got their hands on it, they would do what they always did. They would subdivide the lot. They would tear down the old house to build 3 soulless modern boxes to maximize the square footage. They would kill the art to sell the parts. So, I made one final move. The professional escalation. I didn't list the house. I contacted the State Historical Preservation Office. I submitted a 200-page dossier I had been compiling for months, the original blueprints. The history of the architect. The documentation of the faithful restoration. Most developers hate landmark status. It restricts what you can do. It lowers the resale value to developers because they can't demolish. It is a pair of handcuffs. To me, it was a lock. The hearing was a formality. When the board saw the photos, they were practically weeping. They voted unanimously. The cliffside glass house was designated a historical landmark. I received the bronze plaque a week later. It was heavy, cold, and permanent. I mounted it on the stone pillar by the gate myself. By drilling those screws into the stone, I wasn't just honoring history. I was sealing the property in concrete. Even if my father offered me $10 million, even if Chloe sued me, even if I died and they inherited it, they could never tear it down. They could never alter the facade. They could never subdivide the land. I had weaponized the architecture itself. I had turned their teardown into a monument that was legally untouchable. I stood back and looked at the plaque, catching the afternoon light. It was the final seal. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for them to walk right into it. It didn't take long for the sharks to smell the blood in the water. 2 weeks after the plaque went up, a photo of the mystery mid-century masterpiece appeared on a luxury real estate blog. The article speculated about the owner, calling them a reclusive tech billionaire or a foreign investor. They praised the impeccable restoration and the audacious use of glass. Chloe saw it. Of course she did. She prides herself on knowing every square inch of inventory on the coast. She didn't know it was mine. But she knew she wanted the commission. She tracked the address. She probably looked up the LLC and hit a dead end. But that wouldn't stop her. She figured she could just drive up, charm the owner, and secure the listing of the decade. And she brought back up. I was in the kitchen, polishing the quartzite island, when I saw the black SUV wind its way up the long, gravel driveway. It was my father's car. I didn't panic. I didn't hide. I had been waiting for this moment since the day I signed the deed. I walked to the massive, 12-foot glass pivot door that served as the main entrance. I locked it. Then, I stood there, right in the center of the frame, visible but untouchable. They got out of the car. My father, Richard, looked around at the property with a hunger I recognized. He was calculating the square footage, the view, the timber value. My mother, Patricia, was already pointing at the landscaping, critiquing the placement of the ferns. Chloe was on her phone, likely drafting a sold post for Instagram. They walked up the slate path, their heels clicking, their voices carrying that confident ownership tone they used on everything they hadn't earned. I bet they're from California. I heard Chloe say, "I'll handle the introduction. We need to be aggressive on the asking price." They reached the door. They looked through the glass. And then, they stopped. The silence that fell over them was absolute. I watched the recognition hit them in waves. First confusion. Why is the failure daughter standing in this multi-million-dollar foyer? Then denial. Maybe she's the maid. Maybe she's squatting. And finally, the crushing, undeniable weight of the truth. My father's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen. Chloe dropped her phone. My mother put a hand to her chest. Not in relief that I was okay, but in shock. They started banging on the glass. "Cleo!" my father shouted, his voice muffled by the double-paned storm glass. "Open this door. Open it right now. What have you done?" "This is insane," Chloe screamed, her professional mask slipping to reveal the jealous child underneath. "How did you get in here? Who owns this?" I didn't answer. I just stood there, staring at them. You would think a family seeing their lost daughter successful would be happy. You would think they would feel pride. But that isn't how toxic family systems work. There is a psychological concept called narcissistic injury. When the person you have designated as the scapegoat, the one who is supposed to be broken so you can feel whole, suddenly rises above you, it doesn't feel like a surprise. It feels like an attack. My success was a mirror reflecting their own mediocrity. If I was the architect of this masterpiece, then their judgment of me was flawed. If their judgment was flawed, their entire hierarchy was a lie. They weren't banging on the door because they wanted to see me. They were banging on the door because they needed to break me back down into something they could understand. They needed to regain control of the narrative. I watched them rage. I watched them try the handle. I watched my father point a finger at me, mouthing threats about lawsuits and fraud. I picked up my phone. I looked my father in the eye through the glass. I typed 4 words. "Get off my property." I hit send. I saw my father's phone buzz in his hand. He looked down. He read it. He looked back up at me. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. He realized the glass wasn't just a window. It was a wall. And he was on the outside. The engine of their SUV roared to life. A harsh, mechanical intrusion on the sound of the ocean. I watched the taillights disappear down the winding driveway. Red eyes blinking into the tree line until they were gone. The silence that rushed back in didn't feel empty. It felt heavy, like a gold bar. I stood in the foyer for a long time. The afternoon sun shifted, casting long, geometric shadows across the floorboards I had laid with my own hands. I expected to feel guilt. I expected a familiar voice to whisper that I was a bad daughter, that I was cruel, that family is everything. But the voice didn't come. Instead, I looked around at the fortress I had built. I looked at the bronze plaque by the gate that legally protected this place from their greed. I looked at the steel beams that held the roof up against the coastal winds. I realized that while they were chasing curb appeal, the shallow, surface-level approval of strangers, I had been building structure. I walked out onto the cantilevered deck and breathed in the salt air. It tasted different today. It tasted like ownership. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. "You think you're better than us, you're just a sneak. Dad is going to call his lawyer." I didn't reply. I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I opened the settings on my phone. I selected her contact. Block. I selected my father. Block. I selected my mother. Block. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of architectural maintenance. You don't let termites live in the foundation of a landmark. You remove them. I sat on the edge of the deck, my legs dangling over the cliffside, watching the Pacific waves crash against the rocks below. They would tell stories about me. They would tell their friends I swindled them, or that I was ungrateful, or that I had lost my mind. They would try to rewrite history to save their egos. Let them. I knew the truth. I knew the difference between price and value. They knew the price of everything: the land, the commission, the materials. But they knew the value of nothing. They didn't value history. They didn't value art. And they certainly didn't value me. I had spent 28 years trying to build a home inside their approval. And it was like trying to build a castle on quicksand. Now, I had bedrock. I built a life they said I'd never have. And I did it on my own terms. In my own time. With my own two hands. If you are listening to this, and you are currently the quiet one, the one they underestimate, the one they mock, stay in the shadows. Keep working. Let them laugh. Let them think you are failing while you are pouring the foundation of your empire. Build your fortress in silence. And when they finally come knocking, demanding to be let in, don't open the door.